Hello everyone. I'd like to introduce a few people. We've got on my right here Julia Belize from Catholic Education in the Northern Territory in Darwin. This is Dan Young. I'm Jacqueline Conboy. And Dan and I are from Our Lady of the Sacred Heart Thamara Catholic College in Wadair. And we are very pleased to sponsor this particular session. But we'd like to invite everyone out there and your friends, maybe you could let them know, come up to our table either tomorrow or the next day. If you'd like a challenge, if you'd like to come and teach remote, 420 k's southwest of Darwin, and give of your heart and be in a fabulous community, you would be most welcome to come and talk to us. Dan, would you like to say something?
I went up to Wadair from Auckland, and I have been teaching there for 3 years. It's a fantastic community with lots of amazing local teachers and staff who make my day, and the smiles that I get are fantastic and infectious. So thank you.
Thank you. And of course there are many other schools that are remote. We're not the only school, and I know that everyone is looking for great teachers. But for everyone, no matter if you're a beginning teacher or if you think you're towards the end of your career, come for a sea change. We're on the coast. Okay, you can't swim, there are crocodiles, but well worth the visit. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We will come up and have... In fact, that's a beautiful segue because we're going to talk about teacher supply, and I think that's, Wadair would be a challenging place. So I'm really delighted to hear you all evangelising about Wadair, which is, thank you so much indeed, and do go and visit some of the other remote schools' little presentations. Now, we are going to talk about teacher workforce shortages and attracting and retaining teachers. And of course, this has been high on the agenda for successive state and federal governments in recent years. Last month, the new Federal Education Minister, Jason Clare, you might recall, held a quite widely published teacher workforce roundtable with education ministers and experts to describe to talk about what's being described as a nationwide crisis. The word crisis is very frequent, isn't it? in media coverage of a lot of things these days. I noticed the AMA the other day talked about the parlous crisis in GP, in general practice. And I sort of thought, because is it parlous? Is it a crisis? Anyway, you know what I mean. There's a sort of a use of language to cut through and to remind us that things are really deserving of our attention. Sometimes there's a bit of catastrophising as well. But the minister did describe the discussion at the roundtable as confronting, and he said that initial teacher education is screaming out for reform. Now, as well as the roundtable, or coming out from the roundtable, a national working group with representation from Catholic Education will advise governments on a path forward. So there is some sort of sense of movement, which is great. Now, to look more closely at these issues, I'm delighted to welcome Lisa Paul AO, who chaired the expert panel on quality initial teacher education, ITE, that review in 2021. And Glenn Fahey is from the Centre for Independent Studies. He's researched and written extensively on these issues. Lisa's virtual, as you can see. You can hear us okay, Lisa?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes, we can hear you. So we're going to try to explore what the review and the data really tells us about challenges underlying teacher workforce issues and what might be now needed. Lisa, just quickly, Lisa served as Secretary of the Federal Department of Education from 2004 till 2016, and she's been awarded a Public Service Medal for her work as Chair of the Commonwealth Bali Interagency Task Force following the Bali bombing, so, a very wide range. And then appointed an officer in the Order of Australia in 2011 for distinguished service to public sector leadership. Glenn is the Director of the Education Program with a particular focus on education finance and accountability. He's particularly looked at a conceptual development of an accountability framework to support strategic governments governance of education systems across OECD countries. And so, you know, I just think we're blessed with some very well qualified people to talk about this today. So look, thank you both. Now to start, Lisa, I will ask you to outline the key findings from that expert review panel, which was reported on earlier this year. Could you please bring us up to date?
Sure, and thank you so much. So we did the review over 6 months last year. It was commissioned by the former government, has been taken on by the current government. And in the course of the review, we heard from 3,000 individuals and organisations. And my number one message to Catholic educators today is that I think there's potential for even deeper partnerships between schools and systems and universities, especially, of course, with ACU and Notre Dame. I think schools could be much more demanding of universities in terms of what they want graduates to be able to do and to know when they walk into the classroom for the very first time. I think universities could be much more demanding of employers about what types of teachers employers will need for what disciplines at what year level when. And I think that deeper partnerships could support teachers throughout their entire careers, actually, from their initial teacher education right through to success in the classroom. So we looked at, Geraldine, we defined success in the classroom in a really common sense way in the review, which is a teacher able to offer a year or more's worth of learning growth to their students in any given year. And I'll tell you what, if we could have filled in the following equation, we could have done the review in half an hour, and that was, what are the factors in teacher candidate selection, personal or otherwise, that correlate positively with a teacher able to offer a year or more's worth of learning growth to their students in any given year? Plus, what are the factors inside initial teacher education in universities that correlate positively with being able to offer a year or more's worth of learning growth in any given year? Plus, what are the factors in early career that correlate positively? Well, those data were not available at the time, and I am delighted to say that ACU and Claire Wyatt-Smith up in Brisbane are working on those things as we speak, but it was a bit of a shock to us. And you might also be intrigued to know that that common sense definition of success was contested by some senior education academics, one of whom said to me, but test results don't tell you whether teachers are improving society. And I can't feel more strongly that that's a false dichotomy. And if there's any area that's able to bring those two things together, it's got to be Catholic schools, to bring together both academic achievement with making the world a better place. In terms of teacher workforce, because the largest in-school factor in students' learning is, of course, the quality of the teaching they receive, we were clear that issues of supply must not and need not be in tension with quality. And the review had some good news in this regard, which is we found that mid-career people with a relevant degree like maths would go from 1 in 10 being interested in becoming a teacher to 4 in 10 being interested in becoming a teacher with the right incentives. But we also found an urgent need for more granular forecasting of teacher demand by employers, and we recommended a national approach. So overall, I'd say that if our recommendations are fully implemented, they should help shift the dial in students' learning outcomes as well as alleviate teacher shortages. We looked at 3 main areas in terms of our recommendations: attraction, and of course we made recommendations about raising the status of teaching. And I'll just mention to this audience that I spoke in the context of the review to former Governor-General and former Chancellor of the ACU, Sir Peter Cosgrove. And he said to me, quote, "Teachers are the guardians of the national treasure." And I just feel that's the heart of what the review was and everything we do. So we did make recommendations on raising the status. We also made recommendations about an incentive structure to attract high achieving school leavers and mid-career changes. And that not only needs to include financial and other incentives, but also needs to include accelerated pathways into teaching, because it was clear from our research that mid-career changers need to earn as they learn. Naturally, we focused mainly on initial teacher education in universities, and pretty well every teacher we heard from told us that they would have liked a more practical initial teacher education. In particular, they absolutely consistently said to us they felt underprepared in teaching reading, teaching maths, dealing with parents, managing classroom behaviour, teaching students with a disability, and working with students from diverse backgrounds. And as one of the ministers in Jason Clare's recent ministerial meeting said, well, what else is there?
Yes.
And perhaps that in part explains the high dropout rate from universities. So the dropout rate from teacher undergraduate courses is 50%, whereas across all degrees is only 30%. So we made a lot of recommendations for universities. We recommend that they offer more practical education, that students have earlier opportunities to work out if they're suited to teaching, that practicing teachers have more of a role in initial teacher education, that our initial teacher education focus on best evidence, for example, in teaching how to teach reading. We recommended more funding for various things, including a new centre of excellence, which would teach, research and evaluate best teaching practice. And we also recommended, for the first time, linking funding, university funding, with performance of teacher faculties in universities. And lastly, we did look at early career and made some recommendations about developing national mentor guidelines and such like. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting indeed. I must say that that three-way, the school, the university, the employer, that rubric of looking at it, I wasn't quite expecting that. I don't think I've heard that before a lot. Is that a new thinking? Maybe
the notion of partnerships isn't new, but I guess for today, when I was thinking this through, I thought, okay, let's not just talk about workforce and teacher shortages and the review. Let's talk about what a group that's listening today could do. And we did find in the review that once someone had been to university and then entered the classroom, there's not necessarily any further connection with the university. And it's long actually been a view of mine that employers could be much, much more demanding of the universities from which they receive. You can imagine the medical profession. If the medical profession didn't receive graduates of a certain calibre, they'd be completely up in arms. So I think this notion of partnership, we heard the notion of partnerships a lot in the review. It wasn't the central theme. The central themes were the ones that I've described that went to our recommendations. But I think for today, it's a nice way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, actually at the Job Summit, Mike Henry, the head of BHP, made a point that they've set up, and I know they're not the only ones, a sort of their own academy to train people, because they felt the digital skills were being so poorly handed on, and they felt they weren't being given the sort of candidates whom they needed, and they were having great success, he said, and throwing an enormous amount of money at it, I might add, a lot of money. Anyway, that's another story. Glenn, you've taken a look at the data and the research. You're not as pessimistic, I understand, about teacher shortages as is the public relating of them.
Look, that's largely right, and in part it's because I think we really do owe it to the profession to come to these issues really from a position of a really measured position, and I think that your opening comments reflect that a lot of the public commentary has been catastrophic in some respects, and has sometimes been disconnected with where the actual numbers are. And I'm a numbers guy, I've got to confess. And when I talk about the numbers, when we talk about the teacher workforce, it's not to dismiss or away the human element toward that in any way, but it's just to bring a sense of gravity toward it in ways that we can look at that are measurable. So the large reason why I'm I guess less concerned about where we sit is because I think it's important that we separate out the kind of short-term challenges that we're faced with and the longer-term structural situation. And that's to show that we do have obviously very significant short-term issues, but our long-term outlook is largely intact, and actually that longer-term horizon is reasonably healthy in some respects. And what people may not be aware of is that we actually have a larger teacher workforce today than ever before. There's more than 300,000 full-time equivalent teachers in Australia, and that's been growing at around 2% per year every year. And if we look at the long-term picture of that, over 20 years, we increased the number of teachers by about 37%, while students increased by about 23%. So what that says is that over the last 20 years, we've increased our capacity to be able to serve students. Now, of course, there's a lot more complexity around that as far as the nature of our intakes and how we service them, but just as a big picture, we are increasing the number of teachers year on year, and that allows us to start from a reasonably good position. Now, where we have current issues, of course, the days lost to illness at the moment and the absences, as they affect all other workplaces as well, we do see that the data that I look at suggests that we're losing about twice as many days this year than what you would normally find. That's got obvious implications around disruption, but is also transitory and hopefully something that's only a temporary impact upon us, and that's to do with COVID and the seasonal impacts of this year's flu. And the other issue that we've got to be cognizant of is that we are also in the tightest macroeconomic labour market that we've been in for 50 years. And that does introduce a range of capacity limitations that impact upon all other sectors as well. And it's not just teaching that faces particular shortage issues at the moment. There's many other sectors that do too. It doesn't mean that they don't matter. It just means that we've got to put a sense of proportion and scale to the way that we approach and understand the challenges and how we approach them. And that's to look at it within the context of a wider shortage, not just one that impacts upon teaching alone. If I can share 4 quick reasons why I'm reasonably optimistic about it. One is that while we talk a lot about the risk of attrition, actual attrition data shows that not that many teachers are actually leaving the profession. It doesn't mean that everything's rosy, but it means that we don't see as many teachers exiting as what we would have feared. The data suggests that around 4% to 5% of teachers leave each year, and that's around half of what you have in the wider economy. And it's also been pretty much stable over the last 20 years. If anything, it's trended slightly down, and there's a few reasons why it might increase a little bit, but I'm not left to fear that that's a significant and imminent major threat to our capacity to run schools in the way that we currently do. The second is that the status of the teaching profession is often downplayed, but a lot of the internationally comparative data suggests that we're actually a lot more optimistic about the teaching profession than what we often hear. And that leads me to be reasonably confident that we're doing a lot of things right. And there's mostly a positive message that we can say about the work of teachers and the way that they're valued by society. Third is that while we've had an issue with the ITE pipeline in recent years, I also see reasons why that's likely to turn around in the near future. A major reason for that is a demographic dividend that's coming our way. In the mid-2000s, we had a baby bonus. Those people are now graduating. So there's a huge market of potential teachers that can soon hit the ITE pipeline if we're smart in recruiting them to do so. And we don't have the issue about retention in ITE qualifications that Lisa has alluded to. And the fourth reason, and it's why, is to do with demand, and that's the demand for teachers. A lot of the discussion often takes place when we look at just supply alone and we don't look at the demand piece to it. Now, the more that we have students that enter the school system, obviously the more we need teachers, the more teachers we require to service the same students. It's more complicated than that, but as a starting point, that's the most important demand lever. When we look at the demand picture, it's actually a lot softer in the 10 years ahead of us than the 20 years behind us. Our population growth is at historic lows at the moment. And if we look at the incoming population into schools, this has actually been declining in the last few years. And that suggests declining pressure upon schools in the years ahead of us. Over the next 10 years, for instance, and I'll cite New South Wales, but the pattern is similar elsewhere, it's expected that the student age population will increase by only 3.36% over 10 years. If you compare the last 20 years, which increased by 23%, that's historically quite slow. So it means that we're not going to see the same increases in demand from population that we had seen in the past, and it means that we don't need to be quite as fearful about what that medium-term outlook looks like.
Oh, well, that's certainly not what I was expecting you to say, so that's very interesting. Well, so within that, how do we get the right candidates for teaching? Because by the sound of it, this could be a very good moment for us to really change the way we think. Is that right? If we're not servicing so many people, is that how you see it?
Well, the good news is we already get great teachers. Of course, many of them are here today. We have been able to recruit a lot of teachers to the system for many, many years. We have had some chronic areas of shortage where we've struggled to meet the needs within the sector. And the most obvious there are geography, subject and specialisation. That is, we've always struggled to find regional and remote, as the sponsors noted. We've always struggled with certain subject areas like maths and science in particular, but some others too, but particularly those. And we struggle with special education educators. And as the complexity of student needs has grown in the last couple of decades, that has created an additional area of that market that needs to be serviced. I think when we look at the capacity for us to really recruit and capitalise on the potential growth of the teacher workforce, it's to look at being able to better prepare teachers in those specific areas of need, not just looking at it in a kind of one-size-fits-all approach.
How do you feel about this, Lisa, in terms of what comes down the pipeline in the next few years?
I think there's many things we can do to increase the probability or the opportunity for more people to enter teaching who are also more likely to succeed. For example, we heard from, as I said, everyone we spoke to felt they'd been underprepared in really, really important areas. So clearly there are things inside initial teacher education which could change to help people stick to the profession. We made recommendations about making it easier for students in university to find out whether they're suitable for teaching. So some didn't get into the classroom until year 2, 3 or 4 even. And we've said they must get into the classroom in a practical way in year 1. So there's a whole lot of ways inside teacher education. For example, getting into a classroom really early for a mid-career changer so that they can earn as they learn. That's an obvious one, and yet it hasn't actually been easy to achieve. We also made a bunch of recommendations that are relevant to the regulatory authorities because it's them in each state and territory that control who can enter the profession. So the recognition of prior learning, for example, which can knock out someone fabulous from overseas on grounds that they haven't done, a certain unit in teaching or haven't done a certain number of, stories that kind of make your hair curl in a common sense way. We've made recommendations that those things be looked at as well. And then in terms of making teachers' lives easier, it's incredibly important that the workload issues be addressed.
That the what? The work conditions?
Workload issues.
Workload issues. I mean, do we know enough about the ideal workforce that will be needed? Do we know enough, Lisa?
No, we don't. And that's what Glenn's saying too. We don't know, as I said here, we don't know from employers precisely, and that is the schools, the systems, the states, whoever it is, the Catholic systems in this setting. We don't know enough about how many teachers at what subject, in what subjects, at what year level, in what geographies. And it has to be as specific as that for universities to be able to plan for that. And universities have to plan.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we hear the classic one is the shortage of maths and science teachers. Now, is that even true?
Well, yeah, that is true. And Glenn was saying that's true. But unless you tell University X or the universities that you as a system draw from precisely how many you're going to need in 4 years' time, which you should be able to forecast as an employer, then the university can't go out of its way to try to deliver that. And I think that's why I'm arguing for these partnerships. That you need a partnership between the people who know about demand, and they're the employers of teachers, with the people that know about supply and can plan for it, and they're the universities.
Could you see that happening, Glenn?
Well, it's technically feasible. The issue is not a technical difficulty. The issue is that we've made it difficult to connect data sources together for a range of very bureaucratic purposes. But there are other school systems that do this, that have got live trackers out there. They've got heat maps about where the needs are and where the supply is. We really do owe it, given the size and sophistication of the teacher workforce and the situations that we find ourselves in, that we should have the ability to be able to track needs and the pipeline and where areas of shortage exist. That should be a minimum expectation. We can do it in other areas of labour market modelling, but this really critical area in which government plays a role and many other partners play a role in delivering toward, we've failed to do so. And I think that's a key part. And it was one of Lisa's recommendations, and it's something that's been talked about for many years, that we must have a national teacher workforce data set. And we do have some of the infrastructure in place. It's really time that we leverage that for the full potential.
Indeed. The second priority area is addressing this ITE, initial teacher education quality, and the review said we needed to better support ITE graduates, which you've already alluded to be confident, effective and classroom ready by focusing on program quality. Now, Lisa, how do we address ITE better to prepare teachers in the classroom? Those extraordinary lists that you presented, how are we going to get around that?
So we've made several recommendations. I mean, the bulk of our recommendations go to this, of course. And we've recommended everything from new funding for example, this Centre of Excellence to absolutely showcase excellence in initial teacher education, through to carrots, through to sticks potentially. So the recommendation about linking university funding to performance of education faculties, which is, as you can imagine, a very punchy recommendation. Although the way we've stepped that out means that if universities rise to the challenge, as I believe they absolutely can, and the Deans of Education are motivated to do so, then that, in effect, that recommendation will never be implemented because it won't be needed, but it's there as a lever. Through to recommending that the regulatory authorities, who are the bodies that accredit university courses, be more kind of outcomes oriented. So a lot of work at the minute is done to say, well, when we look at initial teacher education, how many hours is spent on blah? I'd call that an input. An outcome is, does this initial teacher education course lead to a teacher being able to offer a year or more's worth of learning growth to their students in any given year? That's an outcome. Do their students know something more to the required level at the end of the year from what they did at the beginning? So we've recommended really right across the board, and that builds on the most recent review in this area, which was in 2014.
One of the things that was said to me last night was the need, this is at dinner by practitioners, the need to support young teachers. In fact, one bishop said to me, really, I think it takes 3 to 5 years to develop a vague competence, and then from 5 to 10 you become very good. This is a long time in, and of course, you can maybe talk about, I don't know whether you did talk about the people falling out of the system once they'd begun. I think you talked about sort of starting off just in study. But I mean, did you address that much about the support for early out teachers?
Yeah, well, we heard this enormous variation in variability in experience. We heard from teachers who'd been brilliantly mentored, incredibly well supported, wrapped around, made to feel that, that they had someone to go to, buddied up, coached, And then we heard about a graduate who appeared in the school and was on their own from day one, and that was it. And it was actually reasonably well sort of mixed between those two extremes. We kind of heard everything. Whereas the one that I talked about before about teachers feeling underprepared in certain areas was completely consistent across the board. Now, just imagine, not only if beginning teachers had that first bunch of experiences of being coached, supported, wrapped around, et cetera, but also had, when they pinged out of their 4-year or degree or their 2-year postgraduate degree, they actually felt fully prepared in teaching reading, maths, teaching diverse students, teaching students with a disability, dealing with parents and managing classroom behaviour. Imagine that run-up that was being talked about last night of 3 years to 5 years might be reduced considerably, and wouldn't that be a great thing?
I mean, Glenn, how do we use practicum or in-school experience to improve some of these results?
Well, like most people in the room here that have ever hosted a school practicum will recognise that we have traditionally had a less than enthusiastic approach toward it, because it can be a little bit ad hoc sometimes. It's sometimes been seen as a bit of a burden that schools have got to host a student teacher. And of course it can be frustrating if you don't actually think that student teacher is likely to complete. You might feel that time isn't a poorly invested experience. But what I've been really encouraged by in the last few years is a series of studies out of the US that have looked at this issue, and they've been very concerned about the role that practicum can play, and they've experimented with many different types of models. And thankfully, with systems that size, you've got the capacity to do that. And some of the key findings out of that were that while the duration of ITE makes a bit of a difference, while the incoming capabilities of teachers makes a bit of a difference as far as how prepared they are when they complete their training, what made all the difference was the quality and duration and the timing of the school-based practicum. So one of the key findings out of that research showed that teachers who were coming out of a practicum where they were timed early, they came into the classroom in the first year, where they were paired with a motivated and a high-quality instructional teacher in a supportive school environment, and a school that matched somewhat to the school they ultimately were placed with at graduation. So there's a few factors that have got to align. But these teachers were emerging as effective as a third-year teacher when they graduate. So if we think about the possible levers that we can have to impact that first few years where it is a challenge of finding your feet in teaching, having effective school-based practicum can really, really deliver in ways that can make a significant difference in the early years of teachers' development.
Do we need more oversight then, more evangelisation? Well, I wish I could think of another word for this, because if it's as powerful as that.
Well, so the question is, do you decentralise or do you centralise a process?
Yeah.
And traditionally it's been quite decentralised, so it's left to individual schools, left to universities and even teachers themselves to identify and bring together the parts to make a placement work. Centralising that and supporting that and coordinating that process, it's certainly something that's got capacity to really make that process smoother and ensure that the match is there, that we're matching teachers that are in training to the schools that are best placed to support exactly the kind of path that they're on. And that is something that I think the Catholic system in particular can benefit from, with its close linkages with ITE providers and the size of systems, gives a capacity to be able to manage that in ways that the department schools are not able to do. So to me, that's a real opportunity where Catholic education can do it.
Is this underway, what you're planning, or is it just a notion?
It happens, but it's ad hoc.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen as systematically as it could.
Interesting. Look, I'd just like to go in our last 5 minutes to early years of teaching, because the review said we need to better support and retain new teachers, which is really what we're talking about, and ensure a sustainable pipeline with the right subject qualifications in the right locations. And we certainly hear a lot about dropouts from teacher unions due to plateauing pay and administrative burdens, and the administrative burden seems to be very much emphasised. Glenn, how would you say the teaching profession compared with other industries, health being one of the obvious ones? I mean, Is there a notable difference?
Well, so even on big picture attrition, we lose 4 to 5% of teachers each year. The whole of economy is about 10%. In the early years, we lose about 10 to 15% in the first few years. And that is a lot lower than what people might think, but that's what the numbers tell us. And it varies between different states and so on. But it's about 10 to 15%. That's pretty consistent with other professions as well. One where we're a little bit different in teaching is that we lose a vast bulk in the very first year. And then after that, once people make it through the first year, they tend to stay on for at least a few years down the track. So there's clearly something about that initial year, and part of that is the mentoring and induction piece, because that seems to really make a difference in ensuring that there's that retention through the first year. But we've also got to recognise that sometimes some of the reason we lose people in the first year is because they do find out that that's not quite the right fit for them as well. And that's why front loading a little bit, like with the school-based practicum early on, that may help to resolve some of that challenge when it comes to the first year in the workforce.
Would better pay help, Lisa? Really?
We found that, so at the behavioural economics research that we commissioned for the review found that the end salary, the plateauing, is a disincentive for high achieving school leavers and mid-career changers to consider teaching. It's not a complete wipeout. As I said, with the right incentives, we could go from 1 in 10 to 4 in 10 being interested, but it is a factor. But it's not the only factor. But I think the transition shock into that first year that Glenn was just talking about is profound, and we absolutely made recommendations about universities and indeed systems and so on helping students find out if they are suited to teaching much earlier.
I wonder what the message is for people here listening today, school leaders, about helping or about assisting in that first year then, which is obviously would be to their advantage. I mean, what would you have you taken away? How could you distill it, Lisa?
As a diocese or a system, enter into a formal partnership with the universities that you draw from, which often will be ACU, for example, as the National Catholic University in the West Notre Dame. And enter into partnerships that are demanding, as I said, of universities in terms of the quality of the initial teacher education experience that you require as an employer. And it's always surprised me that employers tend not, and not so much in the Catholic system, but tend not to preference certain universities that offer a better experience.
Right.
Catholic system does preference ACU and Notre Dame, which is good. But, form a partnership that's very demanding of universities, but also offers in a more systematic way what universities need in terms of placement.
Interesting. And what do you think about that, Glenn?
Yeah, look, there's something toward that. And I think there's a unique capability of the Catholic system, as Lisa alludes to be a bit more demanding of the universities that are in the orbit. One of the elements at the moment is that we are ever so slowly introducing ways that we get a clearer idea about teachers' capabilities at the end of the qualification, and that's through the teaching performance assessment. I think that we've got to be particularly demanding, not just about the more generic characteristics, but particularly instructional preparedness, and I think that in classroom management, these sorts of skills. And given that employers know those demands, it's really, we should be allowing almost a market to be demanding those be facilitated by the providers of ITE, and that pressure, I think, more so than the current regulatory space, which is largely in the sense that higher education providers are regulated by effectively what they self-report as what they do, what content is put into any kind of university program. That approach has been not led to a lot of responsiveness from universities in significantly changing content. So I think that employers placing that demand about actual instructional preparedness, I think that's a real key as far as we're solving this problem.
And look, finally, you'd say to us, it isn't as bad as we think. So why is the general public think it is? I mean, what's led to this acute worry?
Well, it's not that we don't have challenges. We do have challenges, and we do have opportunities to improve the size and skill in the teaching workforce. There's clearly opportunities to improve school practicum, as we've talked about. There's opportunities to improve flexibility in teaching, creating more diverse pathways, building a more diverse set of skills and backgrounds of teachers. All those sorts of things are really important opportunities, and particularly in the environment that we find ourselves in, we're kind of fortunate because in a tight labour market, we've got to innovate our way towards some solutions. So it's important that we galvanise that energy about reform, but without necessarily concluding that we've got a catastrophic entire picture.
I suppose it's just fascinating, really, in a way, to think, Lisa, about whether this is, becomes a sort of a moral panic. I mean, where are we heading? Sort of what's happening? Do you think that is infused in this debate, which doesn't help, I don't imagine?
It doesn't help at all, because people think things will get worse and worse, and then does someone think that teaching is even, is even less attractive for them? And we need to reverse that.
Yes.
So yes, there are considerable workforce challenges. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and it's a key national priority. Any parent who's sent their child to school recently and has found that the teacher's off sick, it's a terrible experience. But we need to draw out the positives of teaching, which all the people watching this know well. It's the most amazing profession, and what's more important than setting up our young people for their future success?
Yeah, I just think that the discussion about it, we don't talk about engineers like this, the way we discuss teaching, which is just very revealing in a way to think about it. Look, thank you both very much indeed. That was quite refreshing. And Lisa Paul and Glenn Fahey, thank you very much indeed. Will you all thank them for it? And we'll now move to a little break before our last concurrent session for the day. Thank you.